We do call this special meeting of council to order on Monday, January 9th, 2023 at 6:02 p.m. Those in favor? And that is carried, none opposed. And moving on to our Indigenous land acknowledgement, and I'll hand that over to Councillor Belinda Kistemaker, please.
Council of the Corporation of the Township of Hornepayne would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that the land on which we gathered here today is the Treaty 9, 1905-1906 territory, the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples. As we work towards reconciliation, may we all live with respect on this land and live in peace and friendship with all its diverse peoples.
Thank you, Councillor Kistemaker. Moving on, for item number 3 is review and note any changes to the agenda. There are none, so we're looking as approving the agenda as presented. If I can get a mover and a seconder, please. Moved by Councillor Belinda Kistemaker, second by Councillor Ted Sheneman. Be it resolved that council does hereby approve the agenda as presented. And we put that to a vote. Those in favor? And that is carried, none opposed. So moving on to item number 5 is disclosure of pecuniary interest and general nature thereof, declaration of conflict of interest. And council, you do know that you can do that now or any time throughout the meeting when such a situation arises, or if one does. I don't have any paperwork as of yet, so I will move on. Just before we do move on to item number 6, our presentation, do we have an estimated time when Peter will be arriving? Or should we just continue on and he'll join us?
I believe I just heard him come into the building. He just went down into the council chambers, Mayor Fort.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eileen. So we do have a presentation tonight from Hemson Consulting Limited, our comprehensive user fee and service charge review. As you know, council, and for those residents that are with us, we did a comprehensive service delivery review back in 2019. And this is one of the items that came out of that review, was that we should look at our fee structure and what we're charging and maybe where we're not charging, that sort of thing. And the staff has been working with Hemson Consulting for quite some time now. And I'd like to welcome Stefan Krzeczunowicz to our meeting tonight. And I hope I didn't mess up your last name too badly, Stefan.
No, that's quite all right, Madam Mayor. Even the polls have trouble with it.
Okay, well, I will disclose that I did Google pronounce it, so.
Oh.
Okay, so we're just waiting for one of our councillors to come online. He is downstairs currently in council chambers. And he'll be joining us by phone, I take it, Eileen?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Well, if you'd like to present, just let us know a bit about yourself, Stefan, while we take some time to wait for our final councillor to get on board here.
Sure. Well, thank you, Madam Mayor, and members of council for having me here this evening. And I'm sure Google is as bad at mangling my name as the polls are. Mayor Ford, it's a very challenging name, and it took me about 6 years to master it. So please, you and everyone else are excused from pronouncing it properly. I am an associate partner at Hemson Consulting in Toronto. And as the mayor said, we were retained by the township to review its user fees, and we've prepared a draft report of our findings. And so tonight's session really is an opportunity to summarize those findings for you. And I was going to take you through each of the services that we looked at, some of our analysis, the findings, and our recommendations, and we can have a discussion as well as about what to do from here. I have a presentation. Mayor Ford, do you want me to share my screen and start that, or would you like me to just wait a little longer for the other councillor?
I showed up, Madam Mayor.
Yes, we have Councillor Peter Kistemaker online. Nice to have you join us. Happy New Year, Councillor Kistemaker.
Happy New Year's. Apologize for the delay.
That's all right. Thank you for being here. Yes, that's great. We can get started. I would like to let the town residents that are with us tonight that we will be having an open discussion from 7:05 to 7:50 p.m. tonight as well. So there will be opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. And if you note down your questions or anything that you might want to comment on or have a question about, you will have an opportunity to do that. So go ahead, Stefan, you're okay to take the floor.
Okay, thank you, Madam Mayor. And can you see the screen there? Is that filling your screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Right. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a fee review, and just to sort of put this in a little bit of sort of the context of your municipal finances, if you like. You of the sort of between $4 and $5 million that you collect in revenue on any given year, about 41% of that is raised from your property tax base. You get about 24% of your revenue from upper level government grants and transfers, and another 21% from water rates. And so anywhere between 14 and 16% of your revenue on any given year comes from user fees, licensing fees, fines, rents, that sort of thing. And that's really these are the items that we've been tasked to look at through this particular exercises. User fees are levied for a very specific purpose. So it's usually to cover a portion or all of the cost of a product or a service that the township provides to a specific user, the person paying the fee. And so there should be some sort of relationship between the amount of the fee that's paid and the cost of the service or the product that's being provided by the township. And this is quite distinct from the property tax or any other kind of tax that you impose. The taxes are collected on the basis of the value of someone's property. There's not necessarily a direct link between the cost of the service or the amount of service that anyone receives for the tax they pay. Whereas a fee is quite different. There must be a relationship between what someone pays and what they're getting in return. So when we do this exercise, there is a sort of methodology to it, and we do have to look at the cost of providing services. In some respects, sometimes this is quite straightforward. Sometimes it's a little trickier. You have about 400 fees that you impose right now. And sometimes we don't really have detailed historical information about the cost of providing all of those different services. So you'll see in our report that there is a lot of analysis about the cost of service, but there's also a lot of work that we've done looking at the kind of fees that are charged in other jurisdictions. So there's quite a lot of benchmarking that's been done in order to supplement the cost analysis, particularly where we don't have historical information about costs. So fundamentally what we're doing is trying to identify what the cost is to provide these services. Then what we do is we establish how much should the township reasonably expect to recover from fees to pay for those costs. Some of the services you provide, you will obviously want to charge the full cost. For example, someone who comes in and wants to get a building permit for building a back deck on their house, you would expect them to pay for the full cost of getting that permit. You wouldn't want anyone else in the township to bear the cost of someone going through that process. It's not quite the same with some of the other services. So, for example, recreation fees are rarely imposed on the basis of recovering the full cost. And that's because a lot of municipalities, including your own, I'm sure, feel that there's, a broad community benefit to have people come in and use the recreation programs, staying healthy, getting out of the house, enrolling in minor hockey. These are all things that you want to encourage, and you don't necessarily want to charge very high fees and deter people from doing those sorts of things. So the cost recovery targets vary depending on the service that's provided. And then the final step in this is to look at what fee rates you would need to impose in order to achieve the targets, and also to determine whether there are a sufficient number of fees in place to pay for the services that are being provided. As I say, we've done a review of the cost of providing services. And in the report, you'll see that we distinguish between the direct cost of providing services, and that's really the cost of the staff and the resources that are directly involved in delivering a product or a service. It's mainly staff time. But there are also indirect costs as well, and that can be the cost of the office space in which staff are working. It could be a portion of the cost of the CAO or even council or the finance department, those sort of corporate overheads as well. We've looked at the history of revenues that have been collected for each fee type, really to understand the amount of money that you've raised through the fees, but also to look at the number of users for all of these services and see how that may have changed, whether it's going down, whether it's going up, and what might be expected moving forward. We've supplemented that analysis with interviews with most of your senior staff who are involved in providing the services. And as I say, we spent a lot of time looking at what other municipalities, particularly in Northern Ontario, are doing with respect to fees, recognizing, of course, that not every place is the same. The scope of services and the standard of service varies from place to place. But we still want to understand what is the range of fees that are being charged, and how does Hornepayne fit into that range. The legislation governing fees is quite complex and authorized under many different statutes, which is probably why you have many different fee bylaws. And one of our recommendations coming out of this is actually that you try to consolidate your fees into one bylaw and update that one bylaw on a regular basis. So these are the services that we've looked at on the left there, and the bylaw numbers associated with them on the right. I'm going to go through each one of these over the next sort of 15-20 minutes and just talk a little bit about each of the services and our recommendations for each one, and then I'll wrap it up with some general recommendations at the end. So I'll start with fees for administration services. And this really covers things like copying, printing documents, collecting documents for freedom of information requests, maintaining property tax accounts, billing, compliance letters, as well as licensing fees. And they're mainly managed through your administration staff. They've only recently been introduced, so generally they do already.
Stefan, I would just like to interrupt. I think we have the wrong slide up. We have the airport.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, that's better.
All right.
My mouse is a bit slippery. I don't think there's anything on screen that I haven't already alluded to, but suffice to say that these administration fees are relatively new. They generally already recover the cost of providing these services. They're pretty, these are fees that you generally want to get full cost recovery on, especially with things like photocopying and printing. When we look at these fees in other places, we see that generally the ones that are in place in Hornepayne, they fall within the benchmark range. So the only thing about these fees is that, the powers, the licensing powers that are given to municipalities in Ontario are quite broad. And even in the context of municipalities in Northern Ontario, Hornepayne doesn't really um, have many licensing fees in place. And so in our report, we have put a list of licensing fees that you might consider imposing. And there's the list there under the first bullet. And there are the fees themselves in the appendix to the report. There are also some fees associated with managing property tax accounts that are fairly standard that you don't have, that we would also suggest you consider implementing. And we also suggest that you mark up your sort of printing and photocopying fees by 5%, just to cover those indirect costs that I was talking about, which right now you don't have. When it comes to the printing and photocopying, we also note that a lot of those services are also available in the library. So council should perhaps consider whether it's worth providing them at all in the municipal offices, because you don't really need to have the service provided in two different places, and so that that, unlike other municipalities where sometimes that's the only place in town where people can get those services, you have the luxury of another option. So that's something you could dispense with altogether, frankly, if you wanted to. So moving to the airport, here there are fees at the airport for, refueling an aircraft, for parking an aircraft, for plugging an aircraft, and for landing aircraft. And generally with these kinds of fees, you want a good chunk of the cost to be borne by the people who are using the facility. Generally, the fees that you have in place fall within the benchmark range of other municipal airports. The landing fees are a little bit higher than what we see in other places, but some of the other fees are a little bit lower, like those plug-in fees. The cost recovery at the airport for these services has been about 34%. That's a little low, and we feel it should be more like 50%. And so there is an opportunity to increase some of the fees to achieve that target, particularly the landing fees, and certainly the price of jet fuel, which has not changed in some years. And as everyone knows, the price of fuel has skyrocketed in the last year, and that's not reflected in the price that you're currently imposing for jet fuel. So frankly, the aircraft are getting a great deal from jet fuel at the airport right now, and that should be changed. We also made some recommendations about introducing fees to reflect improvements once the new hangar is completed, perhaps having a differentiated fee for parking based on whether the aircraft is indoor or outdoors. Animal control. So these are fees that are charged for services for licensing animals, as well as picking up and maintaining stray animals, mostly dogs. They haven't really been adjusted for many years. I think it's been about 6 years since these were last adjusted. They're not a huge revenue generator, to be honest, but they do fall, below the benchmark range for the licensing fees, and above the benchmark range for the offences and the euthanasia services. Sorry, that actually should say below the benchmark range for the offences and euthanasia services. And we feel that you should be increasing certainly the licensing fees and the euthanasia services. Mainly because the euthanasia services are well outside the township. I think it's about a 3-hour drive to the nearest vet. So that's not being picked up in the fee that you're currently imposing. So the Building Code Act in Ontario allows the township to establish fees for administering and enforcing the building code. during building construction. And there's about 40 different fees that you impose for those services. And they're paid by an applicant when they come to the counter to get a building permit. Most of the fees are charged on the basis of the area of the building to which the building permit applies, but some of them are flat fees, and that's a very common fee structure. So we don't recommend that any change needs to be made to the structure. But certainly the fee rates are well below the benchmark range. And they are only, we estimate they're only really recovering about 42% of the costs of providing services. It's not easy to identify exactly what the cost is of providing services, partly because a lot of the work that is done associated with processing permits is done by a third-party contractor on your behalf. So it's a mix of that person's work as well as township administration staff as well. But certainly when we look at the benchmarks and the financial information that we have, we think there's a good basis for increasing these fees quite substantially by 50% across the board. And introducing a new fee for renewing an expired building permit to recognize the additional work that's required to sort of renew a permit that was issued maybe some years ago. And there's also an opportunity to remove some of the fees on the list because some of them are hardly ever charged, if ever. So there's some cleanup to the fee structure, but essentially it's really just that your building permit fees are quite low. Civil weddings, I think these are fairly self-explanatory, and again, these are quite sort of narrow in scope and certainly a small revenue generator. The ones that you have in place generally recover the full cost of providing services. They also fall generally within the benchmark range, so there's no need, in our view, to change the current fee structure or the fee rates that are in place for marriage licenses and for civil marriage ceremonies. So solid waste tipping fees. This one's a little more complicated. So as you, I'm sure, know, solid waste is collected weekly in the township. It's brought to a municipally owned transfer station and it's processed there, and then it's taken to a township owned landfill site. And the collection and the operation of the transfer station is contracted out to a third party through an agreement. And under the agreement, the township pays that contractor a fixed annual fee plus 50% of all the hydro costs at the transfer station. And fees are charged by that contractor when private residents come to the transfer station and drop off things like household waste or commercial waste or tires or batteries or that sort of thing, things that you couldn't put on the curbside on a weekly basis. But because the township doesn't run the transfer station, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly whether the fees that are charged, which are set by the township, but imposed and collected and retained by the contractor, whether those fees actually reflect the cost of service that's being provided there. And so right now, because we don't have that information, our sort of recommendations for these fees are twofold. And recognizing that the agreement is up this year, so you'll be signing a new agreement, our recommendation is that as part of the agreement negotiations, you secure from the contractor some sense of what it costs to provide those tipping fee services. Once you have those costs, we recommend that you establish fees that would recover 80% of those costs. And you adjust your fee rates accordingly. In the meantime, we think that certainly when you look at the benchmark range, you would be justified to triple the transfer station tipping fees. And consider making clear in your public works bylaw, we'll get to that in a couple of slides, that the contractor at the transfer station pays the same fees to rent township equipment for its activities as any other private resident, which is not clear right now. So I guess the sort of long story short for this one is that certainly in the short term, we think the tipping fees could be increased by up to triple of what they are right now to bring them into line with what others are charging. But certainly more information is required from the contractor when you re-enter that agreement to find out exactly what the cost is of providing those services so that you can establish a more robust fee structure moving forward. There are a number of fees that you impose for parking enforcement, but you don't actually have a bylaw enforcement officer. So these aren't really enforced at all. And you don't collect any revenue for them. They're really sort of placeholder fees for the moment. But we have looked at them, and we've looked at the benchmarks for things like parking fines and parking in disabled spots and parking near a hydrant, particularly in main streets elsewhere in these other communities. Most of these fees that are in place in Hornepayne fall within that range, with a couple of exceptions. And so for now, our recommendation is that you should probably just leave these in place as they are right now. But given that you're updating all of the fees at once, there are a couple here where you could probably increase the fines to bring things into line with other places, particularly for these ones for obstructing fire hydrants and parking at restricted times and parking in disabled spaces. So the public works fees are, they sort of cover two things really. The first is when you sell construction materials to building contractors. And the second group of fees relates to when mainly building contractors, but others as well, rent municipal public works vehicles and equipment. And there are also some fees for renting municipal chambers and furniture, but it's mainly about those vehicles and the sale of construction materials. Generally, the fee structure reflects the cost of service that's provided. So to the extent that some fees are higher for certain vehicles and lower for others, that reflects the fact that the vehicles are larger and more expensive to run. The structure is sound. However, certainly for the rentals, the fees are not picking up the full cost of providing services. So they're not picking up the cost of township staff having to operate the vehicles, some of the storage costs associated with the public works yards, and other sort of corporate overhead costs that I mentioned earlier. And moreover, the materials fees, because those aren't updated on a fairly regular basis, they don't actually sort of reflect current market prices, and they certainly don't cover those indirect costs that I mentioned. And these are tricky because it's quite difficult to compare these fees to other municipalities because the structure changes from place to place. So our current recommendations is that you should keep the current fee structure. And then just to make sure that these fees are picking up those indirect costs and the staff operator costs would be to introduce an operator fee whenever someone rents a vehicle, which would be equivalent to about $50 an hour whenever public works staff are required to prep a vehicle, to operate a vehicle, or to deliver a vehicle to a site or pick it up. And then also the materials sales should be should reflect current market pricing, and there should be a mechanism in the bylaw to be able to update those on a regular basis to reflect market pricing. And they should also be marked up by 10% to cover those indirect costs. And then finally, recreation. Here we have about 50 fees for the recreation services that are provided at the arena. So things like public skating, shinny, ice rentals, locker rentals, parking, advertising for when the ice is in place over the winter months. There are services that are provided at the curling club for the off season when that ice surface is rented for special events. In the canteen for special events, programs in the parks and open spaces, things like minor soccer programs, and then memberships for the fitness facility. This is the biggest revenue generator when we talk about user fees in the township, so it's an important one, and it's an important one to get right. And it depends heavily on the number of users, well, the programs that are provided and the number of users in each of those programs. And of course, it's quite difficult to tease out exactly how the participation trends in a lot of these programs have been panning out, because we've had a pandemic and participation fell off the cliff for a period of time, and for many of these programs it hasn't rebounded quite as quickly as in others. So we get the sense right now that we are sort of returning to a place we were perhaps in 2018, 2019, but certainly there are some programs where we still haven't recovered the level of participation we had before, and that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the fee that's charged. The cost recovery for the user fees in recreation as a whole is about 21% since 2017. That includes the COVID years, so it's a little, we have to be a little cautious with that number. But in any case, that's fairly low for recreation programmings among sort of more rural municipalities in Ontario. Recognizing, of course, that we shouldn't even be discussing full cost recovery for these kinds of activities. Generally, the fees fall within the benchmark range, so they're not high in a very general sense, but there are some exceptions, and so our recommendations really target those exceptions, and I think just in a general sense that the cost recovery could be higher. And for that reason, we've recommended that all the rec fees be increased by 10% to reflect that. And there are some specific fees, your Canada 150 public skating fees, which was sort of introduced in 2017 as a sort of incentive to public skating and to sort of recognize a special occurrence in the nation's history. Well, that hasn't changed since 2017. It's very low when you compare it to other municipalities, and it's sort of somewhat out of date. So I think there's an opportunity there to increase those fees for sure. And certainly there is an opportunity to increase the advertising fees and broaden their scope as well. When you look at what other municipalities do when it comes to sort of renting outdoor signs and billboard space and that sort of thing, there's an opportunity for the township here to increase its revenue in those areas. And then another area too is the rental of specific amenities, equipment in the parks, and specific park space as well, like baseball fields, and tennis courts. So there's a long list in the report of where you might consider implementing new fees where they are not currently charged. And there are one or two areas where we think that there's scope for increasing the fee rates. But generally, as I say, the recommendation is that rec fees are generally in line with other places, but you could certainly justify increasing them by 10% to sort of reach a cost recovery that's more in line with other places. One last thing just about the recreation is that obviously you're all aware that you're about to embark on a major investment, capital investment in the rec facilities. And so, from a fee perspective, that will do two things. First of all, it could well increase your operating costs for a lot of these services. And so, you will want to probably adjust your fees again once those capital improvements have been made. And second of all, it will also improve your standard of service because, for a lot of these programs, they'll now be provided in, really nice, new, flashy facilities. And so that should also be reflected, I think, in the fees that are charged as well, because it's perfectly reasonable to increase the fees, for example, for the fitness facility, if you've made significant investments in the weights and the equipment that are going to be available to the members who visit there. So just to conclude, then, we think it's a good idea to consolidate all the fees into one bylaw to the extent that's possible. That will improve, transparency and allow people to, easily access the services that are provided and the cost of accessing them. There are a few fees that we looked at that are not covered by any of the areas that we were originally tasked with, and there is quite a lot of. It's not at all uncommon for fees to be charged for certain fire services, and so some of our recommendations would ask you to consider imposing new fees for things like burn permits and fire inspections and compliance letters. Those are fairly straightforward. Certainly, we think that you should undertake a fee review on a fairly regular basis every 5 years, and certainly once the new recreation capital investments have been undertaken and the new solid waste agreement has been signed. And as well, we think that whether it's a consolidated bylaw or you maintain the current bylaw structure, that you introduce indexing provisions into the bylaws, that it would allow the fees to be increased to cover the cost of inflation without you having to open up a bylaw and consider it, as a council. So there would be a trigger mechanism to cover the cost of inflation, regardless of whether you wanted to open a bylaw on a regular basis. That's fairly common, fairly standard practice, and most of your bylaws don't have those kinds of provisions. And then finally, that to the extent that we've relied heavily on benchmarking, that you sort of implement, a monitoring system for fee benchmarks and report regularly to council on how your key fees, the big ones, the key indicators, how they measure up to your neighbors. So just to finish up then, I did want to thank both Melissa and Eileen, who are on the line here, for all the work they've done to help us sort of get information and arrange calls with staff. I really appreciate it. As I say, this is a draft report, so our next step would be to finalize that report based on any feedback we get this evening and in the coming weeks, but we'd like to finalize that by the end of this month, and then prepare a consolidated bylaw for your consideration with the fee recommendations as I've just spoken about. So I'm happy to answer any questions, Madam Mayor, you or any councillor may have, but that's my presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Stefan, for your presentation. And yes, I'm sure council does have some questions. So I'll open up the floor now for council. And we can start with that. And then we will be opening up the floor to the public at 7:05. ahead, Councillor Stefanik.
Yeah, through Mayor Stefan, excellent report, solid report. I like all the background information. The only thing in recreation user fees, I've been part of the Parks and Rec for 26 years in Hornepayne, previous to being council. I don't want to overprice ourselves when people will be eliminated because the cost attached to participate, especially if a person participating more than one sport, say minor hockey or figure skating. That's my biggest worry, where the cost is so indicative of the users, because if it's overpriced, people will not be using it. That's the only comment I have as far as all the fees. The rest, I agree 100% with you. But those are, we got to be real cautious when we proceed in that area. I truly mean that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stefanik. Any comments on that, Stefan?
No, and I'm very sensitive to that too, Madam Mayor. And you will know better, certainly better than I, sort of how sensitive your residents are to those sorts of price changes. And it may well be that, you know, you want to implement maybe some of the more targeted recommendations here, but leave any general sort of increase across the board until you've made those capital investments, because that really then does give you a sort of a more robust justification for doing what you just said. But I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Just while we're on that, just a follow-up question on recreation. I do like seeing the introduction of new fees that we don't have existing, like the pavilion rentals and distinguishing between electricity and non-electricity, and even just having a fee for if people want to use the electricity in that area. But I'm also wondering, when we talked about public works, have we talked about putting an operator fee in for something like tent rentals, because our staff will erect those tents and that sort of thing, and there's an allocation of staff time and money and energy and all of that. Have we identified that is that underneath the public works operator fee, or?
Madam Mayor, no. So I think that the fee that we've identified for a tent rental would be intended to cover any staff costs associated with delivering it or setting it up. The operator fee is strictly for the vehicle rentals. But you know, to be honest, with some of the new fees, you know, because you're not providing the service right now, most of those fee recommendations are based on what we've seen in other municipalities. So it may be that there are some of those fees that don't reflect what might have to occur in order in Hornepayne to deliver that. So if there are one or two of those where you want us to sort of relook at things and perhaps make adjustments, we're happy to do that.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I do think, like, when I'm just looking at tent rentals, if we're just renting a tent at $50 per day, that's one thing. But if the staff have to set that up or to even tear down, there's definitely extra costs to that, which are far above $50 a day. So yeah, I think there should be some sort of fee structure that includes, so that the staff have the tools to be able to implement that fee, and that the consumer at the end knows ahead of time that if there's a setup or a takedown fee that would be included with this. And some of that would even be, like, I'm thinking into the future, say arena, if you're using the arena in the summertime and you have the tables and you want that set up and all of that, it's one thing if you just have the tables and chairs, but if the staff that's setting that all up, there should be fees applicable to that as well.
I have a question, Madam Mayor.
Yes, go ahead, Councillor Kistermaker Peter.
A question and a comment. I thank you for your presentation, Stefan. And yes, I agree with everything but a few things. The gym the rink and the curling club, I think the fees are high enough. I could possibly see the rink going up a little bit, but the gym fees, I do believe, are overpriced. The tipping fees for the garbage dump, I think if we're trying to do cost recovery, I see this on a personal note. I see people, we have 2 cottage lakes that live around here where we have year-round residents that do not pay any tax in the community, yet they come in and they're under the 4-bag limit, and then they participate in the free dump week and all that. I think they should be even just 1 bag of garbage. I think we should be making up our difference with people that don't pay taxes. And also the $50 operator fee on top of what we already have for the equipment. I really like that idea. I think it's a fair basis. But again, when the roads are being maintained by so non-taxpayers can access their homes, I think that should be charged accordingly too, and we'll get quite a bit for that as well.
Thank you for
That's
that,
definitely.
Peter. Okay. Stefan, I take it with in the consultation process with the township staff, you have an understanding of where Peter's coming from in the sense of there are some users in our community that are not taxpayers or residents.
Yes, Madam Mayor, through you. So this has come up a couple of times, which is sort of additional charges for non-residents who use services. It came up just before Christmas in a discussion about road maintenance, and I forget the name of the road, but I guess to the extent that for public works rentals, for example, if the fee that is set is intended to recover the full cost anyway, then it doesn't really matter too much whether the user is from the township or outside the township. In the case of recreation, I think it's somewhat different because there's clearly a public subsidy that's being provided by the taxpayers for most, if not all, of the recreation services. So I don't see any reason why you couldn't have for those services a sort of a non-resident surcharge. That's not at all uncommon. But it would be fairly arbitrary. I mean, I don't think there would be any, we wouldn't need to do any sort of analysis because I think we just have to come up with a reasonable percentage, and we could use, what other municipal, we could use benchmarks to come to that. So I don't see anything wrong with a non-resident surcharge for a number of these fees, but where you're already charging or where the fee is already intended to recover the full cost, then I think it's a little trickier to do that because there is no public subsidy. I don't know if I'm making sense there, but
Can I ask a question, Madam Mayor?
Yeah, just 1 second, Peter. I do think we do need some sort of discussion and fees related to non-resident surcharge for a number of the fees, especially the tipping fees for our garbage and any other items that the staff and yourself would see. And go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, that was the question I was going to ask Stefan, was when you were talking about that, so like the dumping fees, that's one thing, but say like the grader or whatever piece of equipment, the sander, whatever it may be, it might be calcium treatment during the summer. If you're going to a cottage lake, if you don't have to go past the last taxpayer on that road, if you're say driving another, say 2 hours each trip. What I'm saying is, yes, we're recovering the cost, but I think that should be a direct, that should go right into the equipment rentals and pay user pay as they do it. And that way 100% of the recovery is made, as well as a small profit for the township. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Just a follow up to that, what Peter was saying, Stefan, are we allowed, or is there leeway within the fee structure that these are prepaid if we were going to, I'm thinking of one road in our community that it, and I'll use so people know what I'm talking about, First Government Lake Road. So Government Lake Road goes out, we own it so far, and then beyond that, in the past, it has been graded. Can we advise the people that live out there that we will not be grading unless there's prepayment? Can we do things like that?
Yes, Madam Mayor, I don't see any reason at all why you can't structure a fee for that. I mean, you're clearly providing a service, and the Municipal Act would certainly allow you to charge for it. There's nothing wrong with you collecting the fee in advance of doing the work. Nothing wrong with that at all.
Okay.
I think it's sorry, I was gonna say that was the road that we were discussing in December, and I think we got a little bogged down with whether that's actually a fee for service or not, because obviously you would need a sort of a critical mass of people living on that road before you would actually go ahead and do it. You wouldn't just do the work just because someone paid in advance. You would need some, I think, some sort of agreement among the residents, and you would need some threshold of a number of them to pay before you proceeded. So it's a little bit more complicated than just someone coming to the counter and paying for something for themselves. There's a collective responsibility on behalf of the residents there, and you almost have to deal with it, perhaps, under some sort of agreement rather than a sort of traditional fee for service. But I'm thinking on the fly here a little bit, but I do remember this case.
Yes, well, I just want to let you know that I know in the past, because I was a cottage owner out on Nagogami Lake, and in the past, then we, through our cottage association, hired the municipality to come out and do our road.
Right.
So we weren't dealing, so the cottage association took care of everything, and then we pay our road fees to the association. Because this is a lot of extra administration as well, to be dealing one-on-one with clients out in that area, or they're not residents of Hornepayne, so I would use them as a client in that term.
Agreed. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going on to Ted Sheneman. Go ahead, Councillor.
Thank you, Stefan, for your presentation. And I do agree, we need a user fee out there, because if we had a personal use, the person that lives at the end of that road could pay their fee. We would provide service to the end of the road, and then others, why do I need to? It's already being done. So it would have to be like a cottage association fee. Something would be set up with that. And then Stefan, I'd like to go back to the airport report for a minute, because it reads, and it just might be a typo, but it says airport fees generally fall within a benchmark range. Landing fees are somewhat high. Then in your recommendation, you have increased landing fees by 20%. If you could take a look at that and see, is that a typo, or are we proposing to increase our fees by 20% when they're already somewhat high?
Yeah, and Councillor, I caught that while I was reading it, and I'm just looking at the report now. And so with landing fees, our recommendation is that you maintain what you currently have. So it's really increase all non-landing fees by 20%. But the given that the fees for landing were increased in 2021 and are already quite high given relative to the benchmarks, we recommend that those fees be kept as is.
Okay, does that clarify for
Thank
you,
you, sir.
Councillor?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor.
Okay, thank you. I'll just put the call out there for any other questions. Councillor Kistemaker, Belinda, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. I just noticed one thing. I know we have a contract with our cogen and mills. So when it came to your fee report, I just was wondering why we didn't have that included in there. Is there a reason for that, or?
I'm sorry, through you, Madam Mayor. Are you referring to the transfer station contract, or?
Yeah.
No. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Belinda.
No, I was just wondering because we have like businesses that take their garbage and stuff to the transfer station, and we also pick it up for them. It wasn't included in the report. I was just wondering if it was just missed or if there was a reason because it's a special agreement with the businesses, or if I was just curious.
So through you, Madam Mayor, I think I believe those are the sort of the tipping fees that I was talking about at the transfer station, and it is a bit of a it's a little complex because my understanding is that the township sets those fees, but it's the contractor who operates the transfer station who imposes them on the people you were just referring to who take it there and retains the revenue for their own use. And so the township really has no control over those fees at all and never sees the money, nor does it have any sense over what the contractor incurs to provide those services. So you don't actually know what fees to set because you don't know whether the contractor's making money from those fees or losing money from those fees right now. So there is a bit of a disconnect with the way those fees work compared to all the other services. And we think that when you next sign the agreement, there's an opportunity there to get a bit of clarity from the contractor as to what it should be incumbent on them, frankly, to provide you with the cost of providing the tipping services to private residents. And that way you have a solid basis on which to set your tipping fees. And frankly, you should be retaining the revenue for your own use. It shouldn't go to the contractor, in my view.
Yes, thank you for that, Stefan. We have, that was part of some past review that we did on our transfer station and looking at making changes there. One thing that I just want clarity on, when you're talking about the tipping fees, I know that there's established contracts with individual businesses by the contractor on behalf of the contractor because our bylaw doesn't allow for commercial garbage to be picked up. Are you including that in the word tipping fee, or was that looked at in the overall user fee structure?
Madam Mayor, I'm gonna have to look that up, and I may need more time than I have now, but we looked at only the fees that are set out in bylaw 1424. So there is a fee there for commercial waste. And it's $10 per yard, where it's picked up by the landfill contractor or a private contractor. But then there are rates, as you say, that are negotiated between the contractor and the owner. So it's a little unclear to me. I think those would probably be outside the scope of what we looked at if there are sort of one-off agreements like that. We were probably only focused on, the fee rates that were posted that were sort of generally applied.
Okay, so just
But
in the
I
background.
can look at that in more detail and get back to you if you like.
Okay, yeah, just so that we know when we have this contract coming up that we're looking at the fulsome of what is available to us in revenues, what is actually being collected in revenues, so that we're not missing anything. Belinda, did you have a follow-up question?
What you're just talking about is what I was trying to get at, is it's not at the transfer station closer to town, it's out at the landfill site. It's there.
So, sorry, can you repeat that?
What you were just talking about, that is exactly what I was trying to get across. Like what's going on in that direction, because it didn't seem to be part of the report, and it was I was wondering why it wasn't.
Okay, okay. Okay, I do have a couple of more questions before we get to the public. Quickly, on page 13, when we're back to recreation, it says here the operating, the second point was establish a 30% cost recovery target. Where did we get that number from? Because I've always been under the impression that we should be having a goal of a 25% cost recovery for recreation facilities. And I'm just wondering, has that parameter been adjusted or moved, or is that the benchmarks across other municipalities?
Madam Mayor, it's really a benchmark that we've taken from other municipalities. I never saw a stated target by a previous council in Hornepayne, so I wasn't aware that you may have had a 25% target in place. And it may well have changed our recommendations if we'd known that that was in place. If I look back over the last 5 years, there would only be 1 year where you would have hit a 25% cost recovery, and that was in 2017. And so it's been generally declining since then. And so I think our recommendation for the 10% increase is to try and sort of address the decline in revenue that's been quite consistent over the years, and try and reverse that a little bit. And the 30% is really there. You can see in the second bullet there, it says 30% cost recovery target once the capital improvements have been completed. So I think part of that is to reflect the service level increases that are going to be available to users once those improvements have been made.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, I don't, just to clarify, I don't think we ever put it into any bylaws or into a structure that that's the target we were meeting. It came about, I think, just near the end of when I was a councillor. Some discussion, it came to council table in this discussion of trying to hit that target. And I'm surprised that we did hit it in 2017, because we've always been trying to hit it from just memory. And I know 1 year we were somewhere around 15%, which is quite low. So my next question is for the ensuring the fees are increased annually. I was really disappointed about our jet fuel, but I'm wondering if there's a two-item approach that we can take. Is there any flexibility that we can use, like a pricing where it's a fluctuating pricing for, say, something like jet fuel, so it's not annually? Just because the fuel rates can change so dramatically, we could actually be way overcharging possibly, or undercharging in a year.
Yes, Madam Mayor. So, I mean, in that particular case, you can do a sort of at cost approach. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and just have the bylaw say that, it'll be based on the sort of posted price, and you'll probably have to fix it to some, industry benchmark, but we can come up with something to do that.
Okay, great. The other comment I had was on the additional recommendations. We have maintenance agreements, road maintenance agreements, and I'm wondering if those fall, do we use our structure, our fee structure, to make those contracts? How would those contracts work? And I'm specifically talking about the kilometers from the township line out to the mill. that we have road maintenance agreements there to ensure that we're being fair to whoever we're charging.
Right, and so I assume then that as part of those agreements, you know, those you would not charge fees in the same way that you would to sort of a building contractor who sort of showed up and wanted to rent a grader, for example. The contract covers the cost of the service quite independently. In which case, I think that, you know, to the extent those contracts are fixed, there's not much you can do about them. But certainly when they are renewed, they should be renewed with reference to the fee rates that are charged for the rental of whatever vehicles are used to plow those roads, and adjusted accordingly.
Okay, thank you for that.
And we can put a recommendation in our report to say that. That's easy.
Okay. Yeah, it's just that we have a standard practice, and if we enter into other, possibly, you know, on First Government Road, we might enter into a contract there to maintain that one section in the future. So just to ensure that we're being fair, accountable, and transparent. And you did in the final additional recommendations, you said monitor the benchmarks, and you in your presentation said to monitor the key indicators of these benchmarks. Which ones are they? Like, what should we be monitoring?
Yeah, it's a good point, Madam Mayor. I mean, I think that what we should probably do in our final report is give you a list where that recommendation is. If you look at the benchmark tables that we've included in the report, you know, the key indicators are generally the ones that are in those tables. So what we'll do for our final report is tease out the main ones and the ones that are sort of easily accessible and easily monitored, and we'll put a little table at the end in that final section so that it's easy to reference, because right now you'd have to go through every section to pick them out.
Okay, so and then the follow-up to that is, and thank you for that, for highlighting those in the final report, because I do like the idea that, and so I'm thinking annually we would have a report on the comprehensive user fee bylaw. Now that is going to incorporate all the fees into one bylaw is what the recommendation is. And then showing where, say, inflation or gas fluctuated or these other benchmarks, and that would be done annually.
So there's a couple of ways to do this. I think that having indexing provisions in the bylaw means that if council did nothing at all and didn't review the fees, they would still be adjusted to cover inflationary increases. So you wouldn't need to open up the bylaw and review all the fees and make those adjustments. It would happen automatically. Of course, you know, it's probably good practice to, on an annual basis, look at the benchmarks and see if there are any of your fees that are sort of falling behind or, you know, charging ahead too much, and then use that to open the bylaw and make adjustments on an annual basis. And you could still do that. But that wouldn't be an exercise that we've just done, which is more of a sort of comprehensive cost analysis. That doesn't need to be done on an annual basis. That can be done, we think, sort of every 5 years.
Yes, I agree. I totally agree. I like that idea. I found in the past, as we've been updating our bylaws, looking at our bylaws, seeing the holes and where we're missing things, is we've been keeping like an ongoing tally per se of things that aren't working or that are working, that aren't necessarily time sensitive, that needs to open the bylaw immediately. But this might be a good exercise to do with our comprehensive user fees. So yeah, in my first, I'm not at all for the staff. I'm not at all saying that I want to update our bylaw every year. Just having a report to it would be sufficient if it wasn't, you know, unless we were losing lots of dollars somewhere. Okay, is there any final questions from council before I open up the floor for comments to the community members? Okay, I'm not seeing any, and I will give time for council if you do think of questions after community participation. You will have time to ask questions again. So I am opening up the floor to residents of our community right now. I have your names up on the screen. If you unmute your microphones, I will address you and you can ask your question. And I'd ask Eileen or other staff to monitor with me.
Mayor Ford, I just wanted to note that the treasurer, Melissa, also has her hand up.
Okay, I just opened this up. Oh yes, I do see her hand up. Okay, I'll go to Melissa first. Go ahead, Melissa.
I just wanted to mention that when you guys were talking about the tents tear down and breakout for staff to remove it during business hours, there is a provision in the report for $350. And while I've got you, I might as well tell you that we did not look at any contracts with the landfill operator with any commercial. As a matter of fact, I didn't even know that there was any such agreements out there, so that information was not provided to Hemson.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Okay, I'm going to go to I see hands were rising and they weren't. I believe Sherry, you had your mute unmiked. You're
Yes,
welcome to welcome Sherry. Happy New Year, and you're welcome to ask your question.
I actually have two items I would like to ask. Is the building permits increasing by 50%? I think before we would do that, we would have to revisit the building part, because I'm thinking like when someone wants to redo their shingles, they have to get a building permit. As simple as that, where in other communities that doesn't happen. Or are we just talking about new build?
I direct that to you, Stefan. When you say increase all fees of 50%, are we talking about all the different building permit fees?
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, it would be all fees, including the flat rate fees. We did benchmark the fees for new construction. So we looked at sort of residential and commercial fee rates for new construction, and certainly Hornepayne's rates are significantly lower, much less than 50% actually of the average of other municipalities without Hornepayne. But we also did comparisons for the flat fees as well. And those were a little bit more in line. It's likely, as the caller says, that there may well be one or two of those with a sort of flat 50% increase that are falling in the upper end of the benchmark range and may well be sort of a little bit higher than what others are charging, but we didn't go to the level of looking at each one of those flat fees and seeing what the full cost recovery should be, because we just don't have the information at that level of detail to be able to do that. So there may well be some sort of cross subsidization, shall we say, among some of those flat fees, but certainly in the overall sense, we want the building permit process to pay for itself, and that's really where the 50% comes from.
Okay, thank you for that. Sherry, you said you had a follow-up question?
Well, it would be something different. It concerns when Peter was talking about the cottagers and the tipping fees at the dump. I just want to remind council that there was, back with the M&R, specifically with Cree West Government and West Larkin Lakes. There's supposed to be a partnership with the town. So before you do any of those tipping fees, the agreement was that we would meet with the Waste Management Committee. So that exists from, well, I have the letter in front of me from 1994. So I understand where Peter's coming from, especially the non-residents that live out there all year round. But there is history that needs to be dealt with, and there should be representatives from those three areas on any decisions for tipping fees.
Okay, thank you for that, Sherry. And could we get a copy of that letter, please?
Yeah, I can do that.
Thank you. Just for clarification, Stefan, so on the report, on the draft report, table 13, the current building permit fees, those are the current fees, and those are what you're looking at increasing by 50%?
That's correct, Madam Mayor. Yeah.
Okay. And then any of the fees in our current building fees structure, then that bylaw, I don't have the bylaw number in front of me.
It's 989.
989. Okay. Just a question for Eileen. We will have a time allotted for email comments.
Yes. So yes, we're giving the comment period for the public will be open from January 10th to the 16th. So from tomorrow till the 16th. And then we aim to return this to council on January 25th for adoption.
Okay, so I just want to, Sherry, just to give you more time, that bylaw number is 989 for the building permit fees. And if there's places that you feel that the 50% increase would not work for our community, I would really encourage you to submit those in writing for the comment period so that we can get them included in our final report. And I do encourage the community to do this because we have had this in the past where we've adopted a bylaw and then we've had to reopen it which takes time and staff effort and money on all our parts because we didn't see all the holes ahead of time or where there's significant increases or they didn't work. So I would appreciate if people could do that. I see you're unmuted again, Sherry. I'll give you one final comment and then I'm going to move on to Cindy.
That's fine. I'll do that. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Sherry. Okay, I'm going to move on to, I'm going to go to Cindy and then I'll go to Dwayne. Go ahead, Cindy.
Under the additional recommendations, I'm just wondering what the new fire services fee was that Stefan was talking about.
Okay, I'll hand that off to you, Stefan.
Yes, thank you. And through you, Madam Mayor. So often the municipal fire departments are asked to produce compliance letters for fire safety or fire code purposes with new and existing buildings. So those are fairly straightforward services that are provided to individuals for which a fee is often charged. And often those are accompanied by inspections of buildings that are conducted by fire officers. And sometimes there are inspection reports that are associated with those. So again, it's not at all uncommon for that sort of work to be covered by a fee. And then there are often permits for open air burning that are put into place to obviously to allow the fire department to monitor where open air burning is going to take place, and be ready to deal with it if something goes wrong. But also to sort of recognize and cover sort of damage or liability associated with those sorts of activities, and at the same time, um, introduce a bit of rigor to those sorts of activities as well. The feeling being that if people have to pay a permit, they'll take they won't do this sort of thing frivolously. There'll be a bit of planning involved. So those are really the three areas where we've suggested that new fees be introduced.
Okay, thank you for that, Stefan. And just to clarify,
Thank you.
when you say open air burning, are you talking about campfires, like a backyard fire pit?
To be honest, Madam Mayor, I think that sort of thing varies from place to place. Some places are more interested in controlling things like fireworks. Others are perhaps more interested in, the burning of refuse and rubbish, and so it may be that that particular fee needs to be a little bit more specific about what's important in Hornepayne. Than what we've recommended. So it's a fairly general, we sort of said for any kind of open air burning, but it may be that that's not particularly appropriate for Hornepayne. And maybe there's certain activities that you don't want covered by that.
Okay, thank you for that. Cindy, do you have a follow-up question, and does that answer your question?
That answers my question, and no more questions.
No more
Thanks.
questions? Thank you. And Dwayne, go ahead.
Under the public works on the recommendations, the last line, adjust public works material sales to reflect current market pricing and add 10% markup on sales to cover administration costs. I fear if we do exactly what the market is the same the contractor would be paying for the material, would we not be putting basically out of business? We're taking over his, I don't want to interfere with contractors selling the same materials we are. They're going to pay the same cost we are to buy them.
So you're saying, Dwayne, just to clarify, that by increasing a 10% markup, that's not enough, that we should be increasing more than a 10% markup?
I would think so. We definitely want to be priced higher than them because they're going to pay exactly the same thing as we are to purchase it.
Right. And that's been a standard practice at the municipality, right? We want to encourage businesses. We're like the last resort, correct?
Correct. That is correct.
Stefan, I leave that to you.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, I have no problem with that. Dwayne, we were sort of, the 10% was intended to cover those indirect costs associated with storing the material, but we probably didn't consider the sort of market reality that you're describing, and if that means increasing that number to reflect that, I have no problem with that.
Okay, thank you for that, Stefan. Dwayne, does that answer your question and sufficient?
Yes,
Okay,
thank you.
Melissa, go ahead.
I just have a question for Stefan in regards to the public works material. So you had mentioned to charge a $50 operator fee for delivering equipment and whatnot, but are you suggesting that we charge an operator fee as well as the equipment rental to deliver the materials that Public Works is providing to residents?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I think the operator fee is really intended to be associated with the vehicle rentals, but because it's a standalone fee, I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be charged whenever Public Works staff are required to, go out of their way to prepare vehicles or deliver materials or deliver vehicles or operate vehicles or do anything associated with, the product or the service that's being provided. So I guess the answer is yes, if it's more than just a contractor coming and filling their truck up with materials and driving off, if it actually involves township staff delivering materials from the public works yard to a site off-site, then certainly that operator fee, in my view, should be charged.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. That answers your question?
Yep.
Okay, great. Dwayne, I see your hand up again. Is that still up, or do you have another question?
No, sorry, I forgot to take it down.
Okay, that's fine. No problem. Okay, do I have any other questions from the floor? I'm watching the mics right now. Okay, I don't see any at the moment. Go ahead, Councillor Kistemaker, Belinda.
Just curious, part of this study that you've done and the information that you've collected, the green forms that we have for people to put in their issues within the community, was that given to you as part of what people complain about the most, and like to give you an idea what areas we should really look at? Like, I'm just saying, like the building permit fees, for instance, is there one that everyone's asking why we have that on the list or something like that?
Through you, Madam Mayor. No, we, Councillor, we did not have the benefit of any sort of quantitative survey of residents on these matters. Our starting point was what fees are appropriate to impose to recover the cost of service of providing these services. And I think that certainly when we looked at appropriate cost recovery targets, we tried to look at what's happened in the past in the municipalities. So we tried to sort of root it in current practices and trends, but also looking at what other municipalities do as well. But we did not have the kind of survey information that you're talking about.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. That answers your question, Belinda. Okay. One question I do have for fees, if just looking at the public works, different fees could garner a substantial quote. Is there a quote fee? Like I would be concerned that, staff spends an hour putting together a quote, say for materials. I'm going to use an example of installation of a culvert, other than like someone asks for that to be done on their property. There could be substantial time putting the quote together. Is there any justification, or that you could have a fee structure for that, so we're not putting quotes together for that won't be utilized, or they come off their fee structure after they've purchased the material?
Madam Mayor, we didn't sort of parse out the specific cost of providing quotes. And I think it'd be difficult to charge a fee for a quote if you ended up not actually purchasing the material. But certainly it's intended that the markups on materials fees and vehicle operating fees cover administration time that's associated with that kind of work. Recognizing obviously that there might be some that might take more than the average. But in a general sense, it's intended to cover those, what we would call administrative costs.
Okay, thank you. One other question I had was on the civil weddings that we provide. I know that the recommendation is to keep the current fee structure and rates. But the second part of this fee structure is actually conducting the ceremonies. Am I correct? And I'm concerned that there could be quite a liability there if we don't have anybody that's qualified on our staff to do that.
Well, through you, Madam Mayor, I mean, I'm assuming that when there's a fee for an officiant here in the bylaw, that would only apply where to a qualified officiant, and that you wouldn't be able to provide the service unless you know, you had the right officiant in place.
I guess just for clarity, Stefan, was a few years ago we allowed, I'm not sure if we put it in a bylaw, but we did have qualified staff that could perform weddings, officiate weddings.
Right.
And that was my concern, is that I didn't think of it till now, that by doing that, and then if we have a fee structure for it, does the bylaw allow us, if we don't have someone qualified, to just say no? Like, does it have us that we have to have somebody qualified all the time to officiate a wedding?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. The officiant fee, I don't see any reason why the officiant fee couldn't be paid to a member of township staff. But your question is, if there is no staff who qualifies an officiant and there's no external person available to for the ceremony, can you actually proceed or not? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that. That strikes me as something that sort of falls under some kind of statute governing sort of civil weddings and what are the rules around civil weddings. So I'm not sure I can answer that.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. It's just something we'll have to look at when we created that service in our community. I just like to look at that bylaw to ensure that now we're not creating where we have to keep that training or have someone always on staff to do that.
Yeah.
Because the amount of weddings we've performed since that's been put in place, I don't think is many. And that's,
I mean, there's certainly a cancellation fee in place here. So if for some reason it couldn't go ahead, you know, there's a recourse here to recoup at least some of the administrative costs you've incurred up to then.
Okay. I see Eileen's hand is up. Go ahead, Eileen. You're on mute, Eileen. Sorry.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted myself, but I just actually put my hand down. But my comment to Stefan was just about the, Melissa actually brought this to my attention, so thank you, Melissa. But we noticed on the report on page 2, I believe it is, at the bottom in table 1, it says cemetery, and then it speaks about the benchmark, but then there actually isn't any information about the cemetery. I don't know if if the cemetery is missing from the services that were reviewed.
Yeah, thank you, Eileen and Madam Mayor. I mean, you do have fees for cemetery services. We did not include those. I think at one point we had them on the list of what to look at. We did not include those in our final report, and I forget why. I think it was because we didn't have any information about sort of costs and. But let me, if I may, Eileen, let me follow up with. I may need to go back to my notes and see why that wasn't included in the final report here. I can't remember whether it was on the list of what we were supposed to look at, or whether it was on the list with the planning fees and some of the others that we weren't. But I think we originally thought it was part of our scope of work, and at some point it was taken off, but
Oh, okay, no worries. Yeah, if you could get back to us about that, that would be awesome.
Sure.
Thank you, Stefan.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're getting wrapping up to nearing the end of our meeting. And so I'll put a final call out for questions from the community, and also let people know that you have until January the 16th to email comments in. And that email, which email is it, Eileen? Is it info or?
Yeah, I believe it can go to the info email. Oh, sorry, never mind. It can go to the treasurer's email, which
Okay.
is sorry. I'm
No,
just
that's
gonna
all right.
open it. I don't have-
I am
It's
still
treasurer-
watching. Oh, go ahead, treasurer.
treasurer@hornepayne.ca.
Okay, treasurer@hornepayne.ca. And that's at 4 o'clock on the 16th?
Yes, please.
Till 4 o'clock on the 16th. And you can see in the presentation that's included here all the bylaws that were looked at and some of the suggestions and recommendations. And if you have any further comments, you can definitely submit those comments through email, and we take all your comments seriously at the township. For those that have commented in the past, they know that it can change the course, direction, and everything. So we do take them into consideration. So a final call for questions from the floor. You can unmute your mic if you'd like a final question. Okay, I'm not seeing any, so I will give a final call for council for anything that's in the report that you'd like to see in the final report, or any further questions or comments. Okay, I'm not seeing anything from council. And Stefan, do you have any further comments or any information from our discussion tonight that you feel would be imperative for you to have for your final report?
No, thank you, Madam Mayor. I took pretty good notes, and will make changes accordingly based on the feedback that I've received this evening, and anything that comes through over the next week. And I'll also follow up with Eileen and Melissa about some other matters as well. But thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to say thank you for being part of Hornepayne tonight virtually. It's always nice to have guests in our community. And this is a milestone for us. We're into not having our strategic planning documents and that sit on a shelf and collect dust. So you being here tonight is showing that they're dust free, because we are implementing the action plans from those reports. And this came right from our initial one done in 2019, the service delivery review. So, and a big shout out to our staff and behind the scenes that they're keeping this work going and that we're hitting these milestones. So we do look forward, Stefan, to seeing your report on our July 25th meeting, the final report with the draft bylaw. And if there's no further comments from council or the community, I'm going to close this part of our meeting off. And there's none. So thank you, Stefan. Thank you for being with us tonight. Okay, I need a mover and a seconder to acknowledge receipt of the report. To move by Councillor Ted Sheneman, second by Councillor Belinda Kistemaker. Be it resolved that the council does hereby acknowledge receipt of the comprehensive user fee and service charge review report as prepared by Hemson Consulting Limited. And if there's no further comment or discussion, I put that to a vote. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And that is carried, none opposed. And just before we move on again, I want to encourage the town that you can put in comment till July 16th to treasurer@hornepayne.ca on this report and on any of the fees that we've discussed tonight. So we're looking at adjourning our meeting tonight. If I can get a mover and a seconder for our confirmatory bylaw. Moved by Councillor Drago Stefanik, second by Councillor, did I see Belinda Kistemaker's hand? Yes. Be it resolved that the bylaw number 1975, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of council at their special meeting held on Monday, January 9th, 2023, be hereby read a first and second time and considered read a third time and finally passed. And I put that bylaw to a vote. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And that is carried, none opposed. And let's adjourn our first meeting of 2023. Council, if I can get a mover and a seconder, please. Moved by Councillor.
And I'll move it.
Oh, second by Councillor Peter Kistemaker, if that's all right, Peter.
Yes, ma'am.
Be it resolved that council does hereby adjourn this special meeting of council held on Monday, January 9th, 2023 at 7:42 p.m. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And none opposed. Okay, that's carried. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Happy New Year's, everybody.
Happy
Happy
New Year.
New Year.
Bye.